This presentation is the second of three regarding Saving Sierra High. The first presentation comes from our town hall meetings and is meant to give an overview of what Saving Sierra High is all about. For those that want to better understand how schools are funded in California, we have put together this presentation. Finally, the third presentation looks at the facility needs of Sierra High School and what our options are for filling those needs. It is important to us that we promote as much discussion as we can regarding saving our high school. We are not politicians, and most of us are not district employees. Some of us are parents of students at Sierra Unified. Others are community members who understand the historic importance of having a strong school system in our community. Truly, it is our school, our say in securing Sierra High's future. This presentation looks at the big picture in California as to how schools are funded. It is not the intent to present local information, with a few exceptions. It will briefly look at some historic events related to education in California, only to better understand how we got to where we are today. We've tried, but there is no way to make this exciting for most of us. But we feel taking the time to understand how schools are funded will help you make a more informed choice. Our first stop is looking at where the revenue comes from to fund K through 12 schools in California. Individual districts' percentages will be slightly different as these are statewide averages. The state is the biggest contributor at 62%, followed by two local sources for a combined 31%. Federal revenue only accounts for 6%, while the lottery proceeds just over 1%. The numbers in the previous pie chart are statewide averages that not only fluctuate slightly between school districts, but also change slightly from year to year. As this slide suggests, the state contribution is usually between 54 and 61%, but has temporarily dipped below 50% for a couple of years. The amount that is contributed from property taxes is usually around 32 to 36%, with the balance coming from the federal government and non-property tax sources locally. The largest percentage piece of the education budget goes towards all salary and benefits at over 76%, as represented by the three largest pieces of this chart. Services and others makes up the next largest chunk, with only 1.2% of the 13.4% being for facility projects. One interesting observation is that California is about average with its spending on education compared to the rest of the states. But there is a big but after that statement. As most of us know, just about everything costs more in California than the rest of the states, so our dollars don't go as far. Also, there are areas of the state that have more wealth than others. To try to equalize the funding to all public schools, the state uses a local control funding formula, which we'll look at in depth shortly. But first, we have our history lesson. In 1978, voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition 13. This both set a limit on the tax rate and set a limit on how much the assessed value can increase each year until the property is sold. The result was that local revenues for schools tightened up, and the state was forced to contribute more to schools. Revenues that the state takes in are more inconsistent than property tax revenues, so there are good years and lean years. Also, as the state contributed more to schools, so did the control they placed on how the money was spent. One big reason the state revenues can change dramatically from year to year is because more than half of the state's revenue comes from the top 1% of wage earners, who tend to be investing heavily in the stock market. Shifts in the stock market, therefore, affect the state revenues. Over the next 10 years, people started noticing a decline of the physical state of our schools, and Proposition 98 was put on the ballot. It barely passed and placed a requirement on state legislators to budget a minimum of 40% of the state's budget to education. But the state continued to have a strong say in how the money was spent. The state's tight control over local school budgets continued for 35 years until 2013, when the decision-making process was largely released back to the local level. The Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF, was also created, which allocated funds by partially basing it on the special needs of some students. Under LCFF, each district receives a base grant, which increases with the grade level. This year's range is from $11,068 to $12,460 per student. This amount is multiplied times the average daily attendance from the previous year. This is why schools that have a high level of chronic absenteeism not only see a decline in performance by those students, but also lose thousands of dollars in state funding. In addition to the base fund, extra funding is given by the state for students who have higher needs due to the English language, poverty, homelessness, and foster care. If that level is over 55%, those schools get even more funding. And if the student population is over 70% socioeconomically disadvantaged, even more funding might be available. This bar graph shows LCFF funding chunked by grade level, where the orange represents the base funding, the dark blue shows additional funding based on extra needs, and the light blue shows funding in areas with extreme circumstances. The red line represents the general area that Sierra Unified falls into this year. Schools are held accountable for the distribution and effectiveness of LCFF funds through a document called the Local Control Accountability Plan, or LCAP. This is a 3-year plan that is updated annually, and it must address 8 key areas identified by the state. It covers the general population, but also specifically addresses the at-risk students. You may have heard the term categorical funds, which were dispersed by the state for a very specific purpose and nothing else. As the state gave back control of how dollars are spent to the local districts, most of the categorical funds disappeared. There are a handful that are left for expenses such as special education that are not covered under LCFF. As we have said before, not all the funding for schools comes from the state. After the total LCFF funding level is calculated, the total revenue from local property taxes is determined. The state then makes up the difference. There are less than 1% of the schools in California that can be funded without the state's help. Listed around this wad of money are some of the expense items that compete against each other for budget dollars in every district in California. We've divided these up into three broad categories that together make up a school district's budget. The first is salaries and benefits for all employees, both in and out of the classroom. The second category are operating costs, which include most of the things listed on this slide. As we have said before, it is all the things required to bring our students to school each day for a quality learning experience and return them safely home at the end of the day. The third broad category includes all the maintenance, repairs, and capital projects. These three broad categories make up the total annual district budget. In our previous slide, we put all the expenses a district may have into three categories that we showed in three equally sized circles. The reality is that this is misleading, and our circles should look more like this. The overwhelming majority of expenses for any district budget are salaries and benefits for all the people it takes to run a school system, including our hero teachers. Operating costs can take up the next chunk of the budget. For the purposes of our slide, we've added the salaries and benefits of our facilities maintenance team in the much smaller circle that includes the costs of maintaining and repairing our facilities. Since Proposition 13 passed in 1978, this is a typical scenario for most districts in California. There is good news at Sierra Unified. Our facilities team have the desire and drive to do many of the projects themselves that other districts would pay a third party to do. There isn't enough of them to go around, but they deserve a lot of credit for the work they do daily. Across our state, budgeted money for actual repairs and maintenance have fallen short of the needs, as the focus has been in providing our students with a quality education. Only in the wealthiest districts do major new construction projects ever get considered as part of the annual budget. By far, the most beneficial source of revenue for modernization and new construction has been in the form of bonds. Let's look at statewide bonds, of which there have been 12 facility bonds on the ballot since 1990, with 10 of them passing. Statewide bonds require matching funds from school districts applying for them. Without a substantial level of local money to match the state funds, many districts in California, including our own, have little or no state funds. The application for these bonds have complex application and accounting requirements, while also being very time sensitive on a first come, first served basis. State bonds have tended to favor wealthier school districts that have had the local revenue, often through multiple local bonds that they can match to the state bond. They also tend to have a full-time staff that have the experience and time to quickly submit the applications. This November, there will be a new statewide Proposition 2, which moves towards correcting some of these inequities, but the application process remains the same. Proposition 2 will use a sliding scale to distribute the funds that will direct more funding to lower tax basis areas, as well as having provisions for schools older than 50 years and for smaller school districts with less than 2,401 students. Competition will still be fierce. For example, the original language of the proposal gave special consideration to schools older than 75 years. But in order to get buy-in from the large metropolitan areas, it was lowered to 50 years. This means that with matching funds from the state, along with special grants that also require matching funds, local districts who have passed a local bond can potentially more than double the value of that bond. In the end, local school districts have the burden of paying for the minor and major repairs and replacements of facilities that occur over time. Since in most districts, like ours, the base funding does not cover the facility maintenance, repair, and replacement needs, school bonds are usually proposed to the local voters. Local school bonds require 55% of the vote and are similar to a home loan that is paid back with fees and interest over time. Just like with a personal home loan, resources and credit worthiness are considered in establishing an interest rate. Enrollment numbers also play a small part. There are some less common alternatives for funding of facilities. Sierra Unified has applied for many special purpose grants and been awarded some. Grants can be either public or private, but in both cases require a special skill set to navigate the complex and competitive process. Many larger districts have full-time grant writers on staff. Mello-Roos are special tax districts that use an alternative to the assessed value, like square footage, to determine the tax rate. New construction developments often use a Mello-Roos plan for new houses. Parcel taxes create a tax per parcel and are extremely rare in California. So where does the money come from for the repair and maintenance of facilities? The answer is state and local bonds are the only alternative for school districts to receive substantial revenue for facility projects. State bonds can only be accessed with matching funds that typically come from local bonds in all but the wealthiest districts. Federal money, grants, and donations are very limited for school facilities. We hope that you have benefited from this presentation. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email us at savingsierrahighschool@gmail.com. Also, please go to our website for more information at savingsierrahigh.org. We thank you for your time.